So we begin today. We're all going to do chapter 5, but if you remember from last week, the last sentence from chapter 4 really belongs with this section. So we'll go back for a sentence, chapter 4, verse 17 in Ecclesiastes, and then we'll cover chapter 5. And just a reminder, as I said last week, the idea of chapters is something that was created by the Christians in the Middle Ages. This is not the way that Jews break up sections of the Torah or the prophets or the writings. So here's the subject that I want to begin with. I want you to think about your conception of God, okay? And in case you haven't really got something defined, I want you to think about Tevye's conception of God, going back to Fiddler on the Roof. Now remember, we never hear God speak or communicate in Fiddler on the Roof. And yet, you can deduce from the relationship that Tevye has with God, from the way that he speaks to God, you can sort of get how Tevye understands God. So what would we come up with? Clearly, Tevye has a very personal relationship. He feels that he can complain to God, he can joke with God, right? All of that is there. He constantly turns to God. A lot of times Tevye is upset because things don't go his way, and God, why'd you do this to me? And, remember, if I were a rich man, he's talking to God. Would it have spoiled some vast, plan if I were a wealthy man? So we get the sense from Tevye that, yes, God is up there. God cares about him, watches him. Tevye doesn't always understand what God does, but there's this very strong personal relationship with God. And keep that in mind. What you want to sort of wonder about is, what's your relationship with God? Okay? And then we're going to see what Kohelet's relationship with God was really all about. And it's going to be very different than Tevye's, and it's probably very different than ours. But in order to understand the book, we really have to understand what Kohelet thought about God. Okay? So let's dive in and let's see some of what he says, and then we'll sort of figure out his conception of God, and then we can maybe ask, do we like that God or don't we? And if we don't, then what's our conception of God? So, you know what, when you read the Torah, the Bible, one of the things that it forces us to do is to ask ourselves these critical questions. So far, Kohelet has been forcing us to ask the question, what's it all about? Why work hard? What's really important in life? And now we come to the question of God. So chapter 4, verse 17 from last week, you'll remember we said, be not over eager to go to the house of God. Shemor raglecha, literally, watch your feet or hold back your feet. Don't run to go to the temple. Ka'asher telech el beita Elohim, to the house of God. We said last week, he doesn't call it the Beit HaMikdash, the holy house, which is what the Hebrew means. Here it's simply the house of God. Okay? Ve'karov lishma mitet haksilim zavach, More acceptable is obedience than the offering of fools, for they know nothing but to do wrong. Ki einam yodim la'asot ra. Now we come to chapter 5, and specifically we see the following. Al tivahel al picha v'libcha al yimaher lahotzi davar lifnei ha'elohim. Don't keep your mouth from being rash, and let not your throat be quick to bring forth speech before God. The speech that he's talking about, we assume, is the speech of vows, of making vows. Be careful about making vows. What are we talking about with a vow? That people would say, God, if you give me this, I hereby vow that I will do the following. Usually I will bring an offering or a sacrifice to the temple. And here the message is, be very careful. The ultimate example of having to be very careful about vows that you make comes from, of course, the book of Judges, in which Jephthah says to God, if you let me defeat our enemies, then when I return from battle, the very first thing that I see on my estate, I will offer as a sacrifice to God, thinking it would be something, one of the flock. But ultimately, it was his daughter that ran out first to greet her father. And remember, he had said, the first thing I see, I will offer as a sacrifice to God. And stupidly or not, piously or not, whatever you want to make of the story, Jephthah ultimately fulfills his promise. The idea of making a promise to God and then not fulfilling it was inconceivable. Which is why, later on in Rabbinic Judaism and medieval Judaism, we have the whole notion of Kol Nidre. That here's a moment in which all the vows, Neder, Nidarim, Nidre, all the vows that I made that I didn't keep, please forgive me from them. People weren't going to make the same mistake that Yiftach made, but on the other hand, one of the differences between the Jewish worldview and the Western worldview is, to us, words are meaningless. Whereas to Judaism, words are critical. God created the world with words. So that becomes something very important. And then we see the following. He says, Ki ha-Elohim bashamayim v'ata al ha'aretz. And here we get our first clue about God and his conception of God. God is up there and he can see everything. He looks down, knows everything, sees everything. The ata al ha'aretz, and you're down here and you don't know squat. Al kain yudvarecha me'atim. Therefore, better to say little, right? The less you say, the better it's going to be. So he was afraid that people would make a vow and then not fulfill the vow. And once you do that, God is going to get angry. And if you make a promise and you don't keep it, God's coming after you. So here we see this sense of God as up there, all-knowing, but God is basically going to, he's checking everything that people do and say, and if you make mistakes, that's it. It's all over with. So here we continue in verse 2. Kiva hachalom barov inyan, v'kol kasil barov devarim. Just as dreams come with much brooding, so does foolish utterance come with much speech. So I got to tell you, we're going to see that what he's talking about with dreams is not very clear, but he seems to be saying you have nightmares and nothing you can do about it. They come and they go, and what is there? There's no substance to these dreams. So foolish utterance comes with much speech. If you talk too much, you say the wrong thing, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Then he says, Ka'asher tidor neder le'Elohim, when you make a vow to God, al ta'acher l'shalmo, do not delay in fulfilling it. Ki ein chayfetz baksilim, because God has no pleasure in fools. What he says, et asher tidor shalem, what you vow, fulfill. So again, here's this God who really doesn't care what's going on in your life, what else is happening. All God knows is that you made a promise and you didn't keep it, and therefore you're going to be punished. Period. It's as simple as that. Okay? And that's, the idea that we're hearing here. I'm checking now with the commentary of Michael V. Fox in the JPS Bible commentary, and he tells us, some interesting things. If you make vows without proper forethought, you may find yourself unable to pay them. That is to say, to bring the promised offerings to the temple. So Rashi, medieval commentators to the book, Rashi says that one must beware of speaking harsh things towards God. Generally, we understood you made a promise to God, you didn't feel it. You didn't fulfill it. But according to Rashi, what this means is if you're angry at God and you say something negative about God, that's what you need to be careful about. Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, grandson of Rashi, says that one should be cautious and sparing of words in prayer to avoid making a mistake. A very interesting idea, that the less that you say in prayer, the better. Because the more you say, you might trip yourself up, you might say the wrong thing, you might, use the wrong words, especially if you're dealing in Hebrew and you don't really understand. People could make a mistake and you said one thing, you meant something the opposite, and then you're in trouble. So stick to the prayer book. Be careful, don't add, which is not necessarily the typical Jewish thing. We would say, of course we want you to speak from your heart. Listen to this one. Ibn Ezra, another medieval Jewish commentator, understands this as an admonition to pray only in the words of the fixed liturgy. And in a long digression, he attacks the use of piyutim, the elaborate liturgical poems that in his day filled out the liturgy, for being obscure and ungrammatical. You know the reason that Shabbos services are 2 hours and Rosh Hashanah services are 5 hours? The reason is because we add piyutim. What are piyutim? These are a classification of poems, religious poems that were written maybe beginning the 5th, 6th century, going all the way up to through the Middle Ages. And many of them are incredibly complex, and they're basing themselves, the ideas are based on midrash. You really need to be a rabbi or rabbinical scholar to understand the ideas in the piyutim. And more than that, the use of the words, the Hebrew, is not ordinary prayer Hebrew, Siddur Hebrew. Sometimes there's neologisms, created words, and it's really complex. I gotta be honest, I have difficulty understanding many of the piyutim. So what Ibn Ezra says is they're bad. We shouldn't add them to the service. And there's really this disagreement in Judaism about the use of piyutim. Ibn Ezra falls on the side of they're no good, keep them out. And of course, the Jewish people have added them, and that's why there are so many of them in Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, why services just go on and on. Okay, so we're moving on, and let's go to the next verse. We are in verse 5. It says, Al titein et picha lechati et besarecha. Don't let your mouth cause you to sin. Lechati, from the word chet, cause you to sin. Et besarcha, let your body fall into sin. V'al tomar lifnei hamalach ki shigagahi. And you will have to say before the messenger. We'll talk in a second about who that messenger is. That you made a mistake. In other words, you made a vow, you opened your mouth, you said stuff you didn't mean or you shouldn't have, and now the messenger is going to come and he wants to be paid. Lama yiksofu Elohim al kolecha v'chibel et ma'aseh yadecha. You don't want God to be angered by your talk and to destroy your possessions. So who is the malach? So one interpretation is the malach was the messenger sent out by the priests to collect vows. In other words, you said, if this happens, if I have a boy, my wife gets pregnant, we have a boy, then I'm going to bring the following sacrifices to the temple. She has a boy, and the word gets out, and you forgot to bring it. And now the priests send their messengers to collect. It's the guy that gets up in shul, I pledge $1,000, and then forgets about it. Well, what are you going to do today? In those days, you could do something about it. The priests would send out their guards, and they would collect. Okay? So, but we're also told that malach could mean angel, right? So malach could mean either messenger or angel. So it's the messenger sent by the Kohanim, or it's God sending his messenger to collect. And how is God going to collect? Well, if it's the angel of death, he's going to collect, right? That's what Ibn Ezra believes. So again, here we get this image of God who's up there. It's all about, you promised, you better deliver, right? And God doesn't care about your excuses or whatever else is happening in your life, okay? So now we come to verse 6, which I got to tell you is incredibly difficult. Every commentary that you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 6, basically says, I don't know. It don't make no sense. And here's how they translate it here. For much dreaming leads to futility and to superfluous talk. Unclear what it means, unclear why it comes after this section about vows. The footnote at the bottom of the page says meaning of verse uncertain. And we have, I want to tell you how other people try to make sense of this. So again, what we just read is from the Jewish Publication Society translation. For much dreaming leads to futility and to superfluous talk. Okay? Doesn't make much sense. I also have to tell you that they skipped something, because if you look in the Hebrew, the end of verse 6 says, Ki et ha-Elohim yirah. You should fear God. But JPS said it doesn't fit there, so they moved you should fear God back to verse 5, that it was an error, but fear God, else God may be angered by your talk and destroy your possessions. Fear God doesn't really belong in verse 5. It belongs at the end of verse 6. But they couldn't make sense of it there. So they just moved it. Said somebody must have made a mistake, and the end of verse 6 should belong in the middle of verse 5. That's what they figured. Robert Alter, in his translation of this verse, says, "For in many dreams are mere breath and much talk. Instead, fear God." So, again, the idea that if you talk too much and you say the wrong thing, you're going to get in trouble. Instead, fear God. So Alter puts the ending where it's supposed to be, in the end of verse 6. But again, what does dreams have to do with your making vows? Benjamin Siegel, in his translation, says, "Rather, despite the multitude of dreams and vapors and multitudinous words, fear God." Okay? So again, we don't understand why dreams, what that has to do with vows, but he also translates with the way the actual Hebrew is. Robert Gordis says, "With all the dreams, follies, and idle chatter, this remains, fear God." So this is interesting that he's adding idle chatter, talking too much, dreams. He puts them in the same category. With all the dreams, with the follies, idle chatter, with all of that. Put all of that aside. What the only thing that matters in life is fear God. And it's important to mention, usually when we talk about fear, we mean to be in awe of God. But apparently Kohelet, when he says fear God, he means be afraid. God is somebody who you need to be afraid of. God is, you don't want to say too much to God. You don't want to grab his attention. God is up there. He's watching. You make a mistake, he's going to smack you down, right? The main thing is know that he's watching you. Do the right thing. Finally, Fox, over here, he says, "For much dreaming leads to futility and to superfluous talk." Why it does, I'm not really sure, but he connects dreaming and talking too much, and he also leaves out the idea of fearing God. He puts it, like JPS does, back into verse 5. There are many, we've already seen a number, but there are many verses in the book of Ecclesiastes that just don't make sense. Now, why is that? Look, we're dealing with a language that was used 2,200 years ago. And even though we may understand the words, 2,200 years ago, the words may have had different meanings, or the idioms were different. We don't really know. Another possibility is that scribes made mistakes. Things were miscopied, and then the next scribe copied the mistake, and then that just perpetuated itself. So that could be a possibility. And it's very frustrating when we're trying to read something and it's just incomprehensible. It just doesn't make sense to us. When you read the book of Job, that happens a lot. It happens in the book of Ecclesiastes. There are many books, most of the books, when we read them, we know exactly what they're talking about. There's very little in the Torah that we don't understand what the words mean or what they say or what the author had in mind. But when we get to some of the later literature, ironically, the earliest literature we get, but it's later literature at this time period, 4th, 3rd, 2nd century BCE, that trips us up. Okay, so we move from moving now from God into a different topic. And again, I ask you the question, we understand Tevye's conception of God. It's a buddy, it's a pal. You don't want to get too friendly with him. He's got all the power, you don't. But you know what? You're allowed to be angry at God. You're allowed to make, remarks to God. Did you really need to do that to me? Kohelet, on the other hand, you don't want to talk like that to God because you're going to get it from him. So what do we think about God? What is our God? What kind of personality does he have? And just because Kohelet has this notion of the impersonal God who's up there, who's in charge, and who's waiting for you to trip up so he can, kick you, that doesn't mean that's what Judaism says about God. There are many, many different conceptions of God in the Bible. This is just one of them. Okay? And I come back to my original question, what's your conception of God? And it doesn't have to be Kohelet's, and it doesn't have to be Tevye's, but what is it, right? Hopefully, that's one of the things that a serious Jew develops, an idea of who God is that we believe in. Okay, verse 7. Im oshek rash v'gezel mishpat v'tzedek tireh b'medina al titma al ha'chefetz ki gavoa me'al gavoa shomer ugvohim alehem. If you see in a province, a medina, in other words, in the state, in the country where you live, oppression of the poor and suppression of right and justice, don't be amazed. Don't wonder about that. For one high official is protected by a higher one, and both of them by still higher ones. In other words, there is a bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is not interested in helping the poor. The bureaucracy is not interested in, doing what is right and bringing about justice. The bureaucracy is interested in sustaining the bureaucracy. If once you're a part of public life, then your main thing is, how do I get reelected? How do I stay in office? That becomes the main thing. And here we see 2,200 years ago, it was exactly the same way that many people believe it is today. So, one candidate will say, I'm going to go to Washington to drain the swamp, and it never happens. Another candidate will say, I'm a person of empathy and I care about people and about public service. But when that one, comes into office, things still don't change. There's something about the power of the bureaucracy that just keeps itself going, right? And it becomes extremely difficult. And Kohelet says that's the way it is. And you can't change it. You can't drain the swamp. And a good guy with a good heart, he can't do it either. Okay, verse 8. V'yitron eretz bakol hi, melech l'sadeh ne'evad. Thus the greatest advantage in all the land is his. He controls a field that is cultivated. And again, difficult to understand what is he talking about. But it seems to be that as the bureaucracy builds and becomes greater, and it becomes all about sustaining the bureaucracy, Kohelet seems to say, you know what really counts? What really counts is one guy with a field and who can grow fruits and vegetables. Because when it comes down to it, those are the people who are productive, the farmers. Not the office holders who are going to have to tax people. And what do? What do they create? Right? They only create a need for themselves. They're not providing anything positive into the world. So we continue with verse 9, and we read, Ohev kesef lo yisba kesef. A wonderful proverb. One who loves money never is satisfied with money. And similarly, mi ohev behamon lo tivua gamzeh hevel. And so too, a lover of wealth will never have his fill of income. That too is futile. In other words, the richer that you are, the more you try to collect, you're going to be unsuccessful. And so in verse 10, we read the following, Birvot hatova rabu ochlecha. As his substance increases, so do those who consume it. If you become wealthy, then you have people all around who depend on you. How many times have we heard about, the boxer or the rock star and the entourage that they have? And you're not just supporting yourself. You've got this incredible institution now, and there's more people who depend on you. And there are, the celebrity, the singer, the actor has to take jobs not to provide for himself, but to provide for all the people who depend on him and who support him. What then does the success of its owner amount to but feasting his eyes? And we're told, Ki'im re'ot einav. So you can look and you can see all these wonderful things, but you're never going to have enough. And now a beautiful proverb, a beautiful phrase. Verse 11. Mituka shenat ha'oved. Sweet is the sleep of the worker. Im ma'at ve'im harbe yochel. Whether he has much or little to eat. Kohelet, pretending to be the king, right, who's in charge of the palace and an incredible bureaucracy of the state, of the nation. Kohelet is almost envious of the simple farmer who works hard, and because he worked hard, he's going to sleep well at night. But Kohelet, the king, and the rich guy, they can't sleep at night because they're worried about what's going to happen to all my money, how am I going to provide, what are we going to do, how am I going to take care of everybody. Okay, so this idea, sweet is the sleep of the worker. The simple guy, and this is Kohelet's philosophy. Now, we know that he really wasn't King Solomon. Because this is wisdom literature, he's probably a member of the upper class. So he can relate to this idea. He's not the poor guy who's writing about this. And Kohelet is basically saying, I'm envious of a simple guy with a simple life who works hard and can sleep well at night. Right? The simplicity is what attracts him. And then he says in verse 12, Yesh ra'ah chola ra'iti tachat hashemesh. Here is a grave evil I have observed under the sun. Osher shamur leba'alav lera'ato. Riches hoarded by their owner to his misfortune. The rich guy who makes a lot, who collects it all, but this is not a good thing, to have all that money in the bank, or all those, the produce in the silos in your barn. Why? Because he says, "Bi'avad ha'osher ahu be'inyan ra," in that those riches can be lost in some unlucky venture. And if he begets a son, he has nothing in hand. Robbers can come and steal it. Lightning can strike the barn and burn everything down. So you worked your whole life to collect and to acquire all these things, and in a minute they could all be gone, and you've got nothing to leave to your heirs. 14. Ka'asher yatsa mi beten imo arom v'yashuv lalechet kisheba. Another grave evil is this: he must depart just as he came. Right? The idea that naked you came into the earth and naked shall you leave. That you can't take it with you. And people don't understand that. Again, Kohelet is envious of the simple guy, works hard, provides for himself on a daily basis, and when he dies, there's really not a lot to leave to anybody. But his son will live the same kind of lifestyle, as opposed to the son of the rich man who expects, and again, in wisdom literature, we're dealing with the upper middle class. Kids who were rich, the rich kid who believes, my father's rich, I'm taken care of, I don't have to worry. Well, maybe you will have to worry. And what are you, what have you been trained to accomplish in your life? As he came out of his mother's womb, so must he depart at last, naked as he came. He can take nothing of his wealth to carry with him. Lo yisa ba'amalo sheyolech biyado. Then verse 15, V'gam zo ra'a chola. This too is another grave evil that I have seen. Kol umat sheba ken yelech. Uma yitron lo sheya'amol laruach. So what is the good of his toiling after the wind? Verse 16, Gam kol yamav bachoshech yochel. All of his days he eats in darkness. V'ka'as harbe v'chalyo v'katzef. He eats in darkness with much vexation and grief and anger. It's one thing for a poor guy to say, boy, I wish I was rich, and it'd be much better. That we assume is what many poor people say. Tevye, if I were a rich man. That's natural. It would be unnatural, and here, if a poor man said, you don't want to be rich, I'm happy with my life as a poor guy, works hard, I got enough to eat every day, and that's all I need. Not likely that somebody is going to say that. But now we've got the rich guy who says, I envy the poor guy, right? Having so much like I do is just one ulcer and headache and pain in the neck after another. And this is no good. Now, is Kohelet going to renounce whatever wealth he has? If he were King Solomon, is he going to leave the throne and buy a plot of land somewhere and farm? Doubtful. But again, here's an older man, a rich man, the end of his life, who is looking back and saying, the way I did it, I'm not sure I would do it again. So verse 17, Hine asher ra'iti ani, tov asher yafeh le'echol v'lishtot v'lirot tova B'chol amalo she'yamol tachat hashemesh mispar yemei chayav asher natan lo ha'elohim ki hu chelko. And in one sentence, this sentence, you really find the summary of the philosophy of Kohelet. Only this have I found is a real good. Ra'iti ani tov, asher yafeh, which is beautiful, nice. This is the one good thing, that one should eat and drink and get pleasure with all the gains he makes under the sun during the numbered days of life that God has given him, for that is his portion. Now, again, back to God. There is a God. God does decide that this guy's going to have this and that guy's going to have that. Why? Nobody knows. Nobody will ever know. But, that we see is what God does. God makes these decisions for reasons that are incomprehensible to us. And Kohelet ultimately says what you ought to do is every day enjoy the simple things of life, of food and drink and sleeping well at night. That's it. That's what life is all about. And if you think it's more, you're only going to bring yourself grief and heartache. And then verse 18, Gam kol ha'adam asher natan lo ha'elohim osher unichasim. Whenever a man is given riches and property by God, right? God is the one who decides, who sends this one this and that one that. We don't know why, but it's God who does this for his mysterious reasons. Okay? V'hishlito le'echol mimenu v'laseit et chelko v'lismoch ba'amalo. And is also permitted by God to enjoy them and to make his portion and get pleasure for his gains. That is a gift of God. Zo matat Elohim hi. And if you get that, and if you can accept that gift, it is matat Elohim. It is a gift of God. Now, it would be nice if somebody gives you a present and says, it's your birthday. I love you. I found a present that I think you will enjoy. Here is a symbol of my affection for you, right? That would be wonderful. We've got the gift. More importantly, we've got this feeling behind the gift. But the way it works in the world, according to Kohelet, is somebody rings your doorbell, you open the door, and there's a box from Amazon there, and no clue why it's there. It's got your name and address. It's not a mistake. No clue who it came from, why it's there. That God sent you the gift. You have no idea why. The best thing to do is, and to try to enjoy it. That's really what life is about. And then finally, our last verse is, Kilo harbe yiskor et yemei chayav. For a man will not brood much over the days of his life. Ki ha'elohim ma'aneh besimchat libo. Because God keeps him busy enjoying himself. If you're that type of person who opens the door, opens the box, loves what you got, and doesn't ask too many questions, why? Why me? Why now? Just take what you got and enjoy it. Then your life will be rich. On the other hand, if you torment yourself, who'd this come from? I have to make calls, have to see where's the card, what happened, why did I get it, is it a mistake? You're not going to sleep at night, you're not going to enjoy what you got. So ultimately, that's the secret of life. And it's a gift from God. And you'll never understand why God gave you the gift, or didn't, when you think you deserve a gift. But it's not for you to ever figure out. Okay? So that's chapter 5, leading us to a number of very interesting questions about our relationship to God, about the role of bureaucracy and politicians, and how they only care about themselves and not about what they claim to have come to do in life. And ultimately, the most important thing that Kohelet wants us to know, sweet is the sleep of the one who works and enjoys the fruits of his labor. I'll see you next time.